right now so that you can review and watch this after the session. Otherwise, I think let's get underway. So thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are based in the world. Today is Webinette. It's going to be about 20 minutes in length. So another of our series of short and sharp sessions to cover some targeted and exciting content. Today, we're going to be talking about front and back end testing and doing that with Virtuoso. Just to introduce myself, so James Bent, I am Head of Sales Engineering at Virtuoso. As my marketing team likes to keep saying, I'm a simple person who likes to keep things simple, even when talking about very technical topics. So let's see if that stands true. So for today, what's our agenda? So we're going to do a very quick introduction to Virtuoso, for those of you who may not have heard of us before. And then we are going to be talking a little bit about front-end to back-end testing. So what is it? How do you test it? And what does it mean when automating front-end to back-end testing? We'll only spend a short while on that because I'm sure what you've all come here today to see is the demo of Virtuoso for how you can do front-end to back-end testing. So great, let's get underway. So an introduction to Virtuoso. As we like to say, ship gets done faster with Virtuoso. So we deliver test hyper-automation, empowering anyone to be able to create robust and reliable functional end-to-end and integration tests for any web-based application. And we're a codeless platform. It's easy to use, and as we like to say, it does create a ship storm, obviously the good kind, enabling you to release higher quality software faster. So then on to let's talk about the topic for today, front-end to back-end testing. What is it? Now, of course, some of you may already know this, some of you maybe have heard of it, some of it may be new to front-end and back-end testing. So let's just do a quick summary. So if you think about web applications, they typically have at least two layers. There's the front-end layer, so basically everything that the user sees and interacts with, so the UI, what you would see in the browser. And then there is the back-end, so the part of the app that the user can't see. So the bit that is responsible for data processing, data storage, and business processes and logic, and sometimes a whole lot more too. And just thinking that even though we're saying front end, that can be any web application. So it's not just front end websites, for example, although it could be, let's say, a public web store. It could also be a business system, such as SAP S/4HANA, Salesforce, ServiceNow. Basically, if it's web-based, in the context of what Virtuoso can test, and it has a UI, then that falls into the domain of front-end testing. So that's the summary of what front-end to back-end testing is in a nutshell. So let's then think about how you do testing. What methods can you use for testing front-end to back-end testing? So there are different ways, but two of the simplest really are for the front end is to functionally test the UI. So basically, run tests that reflect user behaviors and actions. So test the same way the user interacts with the web application, which could be coming in and let's say clicking on the buttons, writing things in particular form fields, basically the stuff that users do in the UI. So that's a great way to test the front end, but then for the back end, you can use API calls. So testers can basically validate that whether data has been processed, whether data is being stored, even any business logic applied to that data. So you can make API calls and then look at the responses and then piece together different APIs to be able to test the backend. So they're two really good methods. And those are the two really we're going to look at how you can facilitate that with Virtuoso. So then front end to back end testing, really how to do it and really what's the benefit? So why would you do this? So a great way to test the front end and back end is to actually combine those two methods into a single test. So basically you could be, for instance, performing some functions in the UI. A user could be, or emulating a user entering data into the UI and then passing that same data by API calls. And what this really ensures is that you can test that data is processed correctly in the context of the user workflow from which it originated. So rather than testing the front end separately and the back end via API separately, put them together, with the benefit being that you can test both ends, the front and the back, from the user perspective. Or to put it another way, you can get integration tests to behave like your users do. And that's actually what we're now going to be looking into by looking at Virtuoso by way of front-end to back-end testing with Virtuoso, which is our cue, of course, for the demo portion. Because, of course, we like to keep it relatively light in terms of telling you. Instead, we like to show you the platform. So this is Virtuoso that we're looking at. So again, for those of you who haven't seen us before or haven't been introduced, then we are a SaaS application, so browser-based. We're a codeless test automation platform, where for us, we leverage being able to enable anybody to write tests in plain English, whether it's simple interactions or you're going to be able to see we can actually do some quite complex things, which firstly makes this very accessible for anybody to write the steps, pretty much like you might write a manual script, but creating automation. But actually part of the benefit here as well is that when you write your test steps in plain English, you can actually do this before you've started development. And for example, you could be, let's say, if you're working with BDD requirements, or it could be wireframes, could be user stories. You could utilize those designs at the planning stage to be able to create frameworks of tests from which you can then start writing your test steps in plain English. So for example, if you've got a step that says write tote bags in search, you can start preparing your test steps. And again, this could be prior to development, could be in sprint. So you can really speed the sort of when you can create tests, but also make, again, it very easy to start writing functional tests to test the front end. And actually, we've also got this really awesome capability that we've just released called live authoring, which actually means that while you could write your test steps prior to development, you can also be creating the same, let's say, just after release. It could be also when you're expanding the tests across an existing application or exploring it further. It basically means that as you write your test steps, you can see them immediately execute and basically go through and check. As you saw here, we clicked on the features and the page moved on. Or I could, let's say, click on book a demo, for example. It just means that you can write your test steps and immediately see that they work. So you're kind of building in natural language, using these simple interactions, the ability to author, whether prior to development, using requirements, BDDs, for example, or whether afterwards, including being able to, let's say, I could come and click on the screen. If I want to, let's say, click on the 14th of April, for example, then I can interact to be able to capture those, as well as picking up automatically the iframes, for example. But I can see at the same time that these steps have immediately executed. I've authored them, then they have executed to show that the test steps work. So from a sort of the premise of what Virtuoso does, and bear in mind that when test steps are executed, we are launching headless browsers to be able to go and navigate and access the site just like the user does. So this comes into great from a sort of testing the front end functionally in the same way a user would interact. We access the sites from the browser from the front end, but we're inspecting at the DOM level to discover all of the available selectors. So it could be your XPath, your IDs, class names, for example. We're discovering those automatically for you, which also means we can combine with a capability called self-healing, which means that as tests are run on a subsequent basis, if you do have dynamic elements, then we can basically compare the previous model of each element to the current model, and using algorithms self-heal where there could be dynamic IDs, XPaths, class names changing, even maybe localizations of labels. Basically, you're able to build really robust automation. So that sort of gives you an insight into what's happening with Virtuoso. But if we then think, we sort of touched on front-end testing. So if I come to a website, for example, in this case, I'm going to the Nike site to, let's say, emulate a user coming and adding a product into a bag. Bearing in mind here, I've done things like I've got parameterized data which I'm driving using test data sets. So I've created a test data table with my products that I want to be able to search and pick. So in my front-end testing, I could be data driving these. Equally, still on the front end, bearing in mind front end is UI testing. In this case, I'm coming to SAP S/4HANA. So this isn't just for testing front-end websites, it's also for coming in and being able to test functional flows in the front end, in this case of business systems, where we're going through and creating, in this case, a sales order in SAP S/4HANA. It could be Salesforce, ServiceNow, testing these business workflows. So basically, this is an awesome method for being able to test from the front end, going in, whether it's moving from a front-end website, maybe then shifting across into a back-end system like an SAP S/4HANA to be able to then process orders, going through pretty extensive business workflows in our journeys, our tests, and at all times also making sure we're capturing those screenshots, and also for every step we're capturing all of the element selectors that are available if those are present. Where it really means that, you know, anybody can quickly build out these more front-end tests that emulate what the user's doing. But then to add into this, we can also then start thinking about, well, how would you test the backend in the context of these tests? And a typical method might be to say, if you're using any sort of API testing tool, is to say, well, let's just go and make some API calls, set up, let's say, an API to go and send a particular response, you know, whatever type it is, send that API call and check that it works, which is sort of there. That's really though testing that API in isolation. It's not putting it in context of that business workflow. It's not emulating the fact that API calls are triggered typically by maybe a user coming into the front end and doing something. So within Virtuoso, what we've really done is combined to say, firstly, you can absolutely set up different collections of APIs. If you've got, let's say, existing collections, even in, let's say, Postman, you could import those into the platform. So you can definitely build out all your different calls. You can map in all of your inputs that you want to pass through. And we'll talk about this in terms of making sequential calls and being able to pass data between APIs. If you have sort of authorization, then you can map in. Let's say if you're using tokens, for example, then you can absolutely sort of map those in to be able to say, if you've got your bearer tokens and you want to map in and say, I'm going to use my token here, which I could be obtaining from a token call, then you can basically set up your APIs exactly as you would expect to be able to make valid calls across any of the APIs in the collections. But then actually to really add value from a sort of thinking about back-end testing is to say, as part of your front-end tests, you could go through a business workflow. Even it could be coming to a point where then you might store the output of that front-end test. For example, here in SAP S/4HANA, we're generating a sales order. And what we're going to do then is store that sales order number in a parameter, as you can see here. So even though that data is dynamically generated, it can be stored. And then what we can do with that, it could be whether in the front-end test, I'm then going to move to different modules in SAP and then look up using that sales order number for different purposes, maybe for, you know, obviously closing the order. What you could also do is say, well, as part of your flows, what you want to do is test the backend. You want to be able to test that actually it could be by a user inputting a sales order. Maybe that has triggered this to be passed into the backend of the application where there is some workflows, business logic, or that data is being stored somewhere, as you'd expect it to be. For example, if I'm inputting different details around an account or a sale that's going through, let's say, an order. So what you then want to be able to do is say, well, it's not just enough to just look in the UI and assert, you know, is something present, even though that can be done with Virtuoso. What you can start doing is then making some backend service calls, where instead of making the API calls in isolation, you can now come in and say, as part of your functional journey, your front end, now in context of that flow, let's start making some API calls. So for example, here, I'm making a call here to generate a token, which I passed through and generated a token call. Might be a typical scenario once you start making a series of API calls is to grab your token you're going to use in subsequent calls. I can store that in a parameter. And then what I can do is actually pass that token in this case, into my next API call. So in this case, I'm making a call to be able to get user details. So here I'm going to retrieve and say, I've now obtained some user details. So that's a get call where that could be generated based on, because I've inputted a sales order number for a particular account, what I want to do is check that the contact details have been stored in the backend, for example. It's just a sort of example, but of course you could be making any type of call. So now I've made 2 API calls in sequence where I'm using, in this case, the token to pass into the next call. When I've received this, I might want to check and basically assert that based on that call, there are some expected responses. So in this case, I'm literally asserting that the response of this call equals 200. It may be that what you want to do is check that by inputting a particular order, it might automatically get transitioned to an order status. So you could make an API call, again, store the payload, and as part of that say, well, maybe this is your order response. And what I then want to do is assert that the sort of order workflow status has been moved to a particular stage because of the business logic in the backend that will be applied to this. A great thing here as well is that, as part of this sort of testing, you might typically find that actually being able to generate enough data to be able to, let's say, randomly create some sales orders with some realistic data can be quite problematic. You burn through your test data sets quite quickly. So in Virtuoso, you can randomly generate data. So in this case, I'm randomly generating a job title, and you can see it's pretty realistic in what's being created. And then what I'm going to do is use that random data, as well as responses from previous API calls, to pass that in to my next API call to create users, where I'm passing in a name that's been generated, the job title, and again, I'm passing that in. So I'm building up these sequence of service calls, which are effectively testing in context of the front-end functional workflow, now to check that in the backend, all the data is being processed, stored, and having logic applied to it as would be expected. In this case as well, I'm just also putting in, just for kicks here, I'm putting in a bad request that's returning a 404. And in this case, I've just set it to say, if it fails, that's okay, because this is a negative test. I'm expecting that to fail. It just really gives you an idea. You can see here, we've made 1, 2, 3, 4 different calls, passing details between them, putting in place assertions and generating data to pass into those. But I've also done that very much in context of their functional workflow, where whether I'll be passing in the sales order number, here I'm taking API details, which I've mapped in at my environment level. So I've set up parameters to pass into my API calls. It just makes this a very dynamic way, all in a codeless format. So you can see there's no sort of real need to drop into any sort of code or scripts. It's easy to write these, immediately see that you can run them, and also get the output of the test. So at any time for the functional steps, I can look at screenshots to get my testing results. Or if it's, let's say, assertions or validating on payload responses, then I've got full access into those to make sure that everything is working as expected. So hopefully that's been of interest and has made sense to those of you on the Webinette. And really, again, just sort of, we go back to our sort of premise of what we were looking at. It really was thinking about how to do front-end to back-end testing, where it really is about just those methods of functionally testing the UI, but then testing the backend with contextualized API calls to put those together in a single test. So you can really validly test your end-to-end workflows, basically check your functions and integrations behave as you would expect in terms of your users interacting with the site. And that's taken us pretty much to the top of the session. So the only thing to say is if anybody has any immediate questions, then I'm more than happy to take those. Otherwise, we will be closing the session out. This is being recorded, so we'll be hosting this on our website. So if you want to review it, then absolutely welcome you to do so. Equally, if you would like to get in touch, then please do come to virtuoso.qa. More than happy for you to book a demo with us, of course, and have a further discussion around how we can assist with your functional end-to-end integration testing, inclusive of front-end to back-end testing. Otherwise, thank you very much, everyone. Have a great rest of the day. Hopefully we'll talk again. Thank you very much, everyone.